No, I will start maybe by saying thank you to the, of course, to the whole team of BAK for this invitation, and to Marion, but also thank you so much, because we not only speak here in the context of this book about art, but also on conditions in which art is being made, and BAK has really generously offered to also to take care of the child care, which in my case now is very needed. So it's very rare that somehow an art institution thinks of it, you know. So thank you really so much for the care you took in preparing the possibility of my trip here. Yes, and so I thought, you know, first I was invited to be part of this event, and so I asked whether I should in some way respond to the reader that you have just published, but then I heard that rather not. So, but still, I thought in that context here it's maybe still important to relate in one way or another to Marion von Osten practice. So I hope she's coming back. Yeah, she's there. Okay. Marion, I just didn't want you to miss this first slide, so it's great that you're back. So I thought, okay, so my short presentation will be divided in two parts, and they do relate with how Marion in general operates on so many different fields. So I thought, yes. So it will be also a way of catching up, Marion, with you, I hope. So first part will be about certain terms and conditions that also you have explored so much in your work as a cultural producer, referring to this publication. This publication I recently published together with the students, a group of students with whom we engaged in that research. And the second part will be referring to a collaboration with Marion that we did in Göteborg Biennial in 2013. And I thought that maybe not, some of you might not know one of this, well, maybe it's not the most recent, but pretty recent work from 4 years ago. So this, the first part would be more about terms, conditions, and the second would be also what Tom was mentioning, notion of the artwork somehow. When it comes to this notion of once we were artists, I think it's interesting to look, this is what we try to do in that book, to look at what happens when artists during the current, let's say business as usual, which are biennials or big exhibitions, decide somehow to protest or to freeze their normal activities as an artist. And looking back at 2014, I engaged in this workshop with students at the Salzburg Academy, and we looked at this 1 year in which what happened was that the shocking regularity of different boycotts appearing within the art world for many reasons, sometimes from outside, sometimes from inside. And we tried to engage with those particular case studies and ask the question, what is the right, well, of course, there isn't never one right thing to do, but you know, what are the possible scenarios? What are the possible political dilemmas with which culture producers, so be it artists or be it curators, or also us, large audience or art world, engage with, and hopefully publishing this book in order to also maybe prepare ourselves for another scenarios to come, you know, and with the political situation as it is, probably we might expect quite often to be found in certain kind of dilemmas, you know, with whom to work or not work. So I would just like to go through this book, and later maybe it would be great to also have a Marion, all of you, of course, feedback and conversation about it. We looked at 4 examples. So one in which I was also part of, and so that's of course was the starting point somehow, was the Manifesta 10, which coincided with annexation of Crimea. So basically it was organized in Hermitage in Russia and happened at the same time as annexation of Crimea. Was curated by Kasper Koenig. What was interesting was that, well, so that was February, March 2014, and then the calls for boycott appeared, but they did appear not from inside, but they appeared from outside, so mostly from the Western Europe, initiated by people who were not participants, and saying that immediately, let's say, the Western institutions should immediately leave Russia as an act of solidarity with Ukraine, and just after annexation of Crimea. And definitely, so to me back then, what I felt was that, you know, reading those calls for boycott, I could really sign them. I totally agree with all the statements that were there about urgency, about need to engage or need to state out something, except for one thing. I didn't feel it was right to immediately pack and leave. That somehow there was certain discrepancy in this engagement or political issues that we critical people in the art world like to share so much and think of, and the idea of immediate withdrawal. But of course, one is put in this dilemma of engagement and disengagement, and of course, both engagement and disengagement might be right or wrong in that moment. So what we looked at here was that. You know, what is the right, what could be potentially right thing for a curator to do. And one of them I thought was to even think of an option that you might actually leave. You don't leave immediately, but this freedom that you might leave enables you to actually be more courageous in how you practice art, what you do, and how far you can go. You know, when you think of your daily roles, you probably don't think that you will leave them tomorrow, right? But in some way, this notion of boycott makes this the situation more vulnerable, but maybe more also enables you to act to the point. It is also very important and very crucial, I guess, for the institutions such as Manifesta, but in general, institutions not to suppress boycotts. So not to suppress this moment of conflict or this moment of an attention that you might get from outside, but somehow, especially if you share some of these concerns, also show your inner vulnerability and think that this is a good moment also for the institution to rethink itself, or maybe to, you know, re-examine itself. Another thing, of course, crucial, it might seem obvious, but to somehow keep making public statements or keep making, you know, assuring what is the position in which you are going. That was, of course, what was very much missing, because both the institution and both, unfortunately, Kasper Koenig took many days to really respond. And this, you know, this missing out of a timing makes piles up with so many misunderstandings that it's very hard to continue your work as you would like to. The second case was the Istanbul Biennial, also 2014. No, sorry, that was 2013. Actually, I should have shown it as the first one. That was in 2014. Of course, you know, this seems like absolutely very far away, knowing the situation in Turkey today. But the dilemma here was also a very interesting one. You might remember, back then, the Istanbul Biennial wanted to engage mostly with the public sphere. Work outside. Fulia Erdemici was the main curator. Andrea Phillips was a curator for the public program. Of course, engaging with all the dilemma of gentrification, because the sponsor of Istanbul Biennial is also part of the Koch family, is also part actually of big gentrification force in the city. But at the same time, they wanted to bring it on the plate, so to say. And then nobody could have expected, of course, that the reality will become so much more powerful than anything you could do as an artist in the public space, namely that Gezi Park started to happen. So here the big question is that we try to engage with and ask many actors on the ground, what would be the right thing for a curator who had this kind of curatorial agenda to engage with the public realm, with the publicness, with the dilemmas when the Gezi Park is happening, which of course it's a big social movement that deals with these very topics in much more, you know, powerful way. So what is it when in some way art feels unnecessary, but it feels necessary to act? So how do you act from within art field? Biennale, of course, has become, somebody says, Vasif Kortun is saying in the book that the biennial has become very much a target. So many people would criticize the biennial back then, but in some way it was not the real target. You know, it was like a delegated target, an easy thing to criticize. As an effect, I mean, it's described here more in detail. The public program was cancelled. There were attempts to bridge and to go to Gezi and to work with Gezi. For example, sorry, I forgot now the name of the artist who was doing workshops like this. But anyhow, the biennial has decided to withdraw from the public spaces, also saying that even for the security reasons, you can never. There is no place for art while the protest is happening. It's understandable, but is it really the right thing to completely withdraw to within the so-called white cubes? How would you continue knowing that you cannot continue the business as usual? You need to transform it, but what is the responsibility of the curator there? Yeah, here I put this, that they withdraw because according to the curators that would give the legitimacy to the same government which surpassed the Gezi protests, so that they would align, they would see themselves as a kind of a controlling force if they would go on with the program in the public space. There were different positions. One of the positions also here in the book is how Hito Sterl continued. She said, okay, no, I'm going to do the public program, but inside, but with the lecture performance that also revealed the connections and the financial connections and dependencies between weapon production and the Koch family that sponsors the biennial. So she says this is the very right time and place. And maybe this could be also one way to go, that you don't go as if nothing happened. You continue, but you not continue, as I would call it, you don't continue undisturbed. You are disturbed by the situation, and you in some way compassionate about it, perhaps, and integrate it with your program. That's probably one piece of advice drawing from this experience and those situations. Then there was also a Sydney biennial boycott. It's an interesting case because it was actually happening from within the biennial. So that was in March 2014. To put this very complicated story quite short, was that the family that has originally founded the biennial back in 1976, it's the same family who is now actually paid by the Australian government to operate the offshore detention centers. This is one of the board members from that family. Transfield is the name of the company. Yeah, so it was a case of artists, both Australian artists and activists, who have been actually in the previous biennials also trying to sensitize and bring this question on the plate. Somehow it was not heard, and back in 2014, things came much more to the light, and artists like Ahmed Ogut or Libia Castro and Olafur Olafsson, Agnieszka Polska, Nathan Gray, Australian artist, they basically menaced the biennial that they will not continue to work under these circumstances. So they presumably didn't know that before, and they announced their withdrawal from the biennial, but not immediately. So also they played very well with time, some kind of a freezing the board and pushing them for certain decisions. And it's a long story of so-called megaphone diplomacy. You can read it in this book, who is making statement when and how, in which degree, etc. And as a result, the head of the board resigned. So somehow at least symbolically, so to say, the ties between the founders of the Sydney Biennial and this very edition of the Biennial was cut. Tirdat Zohait is calling it some kind of a Christianistic victory. That this, it's of course purely symbolic because Transfield continues, the policy continues. And this is also the interesting thing around those art boycotts, that they very rarely, they are part of biennials which are also very short beings. Like Maria just said, that you cannot do a social project in 3 months. It has to continue to 2018. So those boycotts are very particular ones. They, of course, boycott usually play on time, but they are connected to the biennial, which is very short, and quite rarely, maybe in Australian case more than others, but quite rarely they are really rooted or connected to the real social movements or real political movements, which is a shame, because maybe if it was a different case, this glamorous factor of a biennial or something that really focuses attention so much could actually translate in some kind of a longer term process with social activist groups, perhaps that could be another stage of how the art boycott could be thought of. Yeah, so this is an interesting story of art being menaced from within, from inside, and Ahmed here in his interview here in the book, he considers it pretty successful boycott, because then the issue of Transfield has quite continued in the media, and I don't know exactly what is the status now, but there has been some positive development in that regard. And then finally, the San Paulo Biennial, also back in 2014. I think Jonas Stahl is not here, but he was one of the main protagonists of that instance. Here you see on that picture on the right, this is a consensus that came out of this boycott. You see two guards at the opening hiding the logo of the Israeli embassy. So it has been an interesting situation in which, again, a biennial coincided with a big political event, which was the war in Gaza, August 2014, another invasion of Gaza. And then many artists, and then also, which is also quite surprising, that 2 of 5 curators were actually coming from Israel and didn't somehow, were not fully informed that there will be some funding coming directly from the embassy, Israeli embassy, into the biennial, which came out 10 days before the opening. And then during 10 days, very interesting thing happened. During the day, artists would install their works, they would continue building up the exhibition, and then at 7, there would be a general assembly of the artists, moderated very often by Jonas, where they would question whether they can continue. And then the next day, they would still continue building, and then in the evening, they would go further in how they can, how can they work together in that situation? If you have many artists from the Middle East for whom, of course, it's not a possibility to work, under even minuscule funding from Israel, clearly because of BDS and other reasons. But of course, you had artists from Israel who were founded there through that source. So. You had also the board. It's also interesting how, how the big biennials with all these PR departments and all the efforts that they're being put in the outreach or how to say, image production are completely unprepared to act when it comes to more political material. You know, that you have so many experts in the PR, they don't know how to issue a statement which is political. They tell you, but it has nothing, we have nothing to do with Gaza. That was the response of the board of the San Paulo Biennial to the artists, right? So also how those organizations actually can maybe think of themselves more in the terms of agency. It's another interesting question. Yeah, and so this is again, we interviewed, for example, Galit Eliat, who has been one of the curators. Also, Galit and Charles Esche, they kind of risked everything, so to say. So they completely criticized the board and sided with the artists. At the end, yes, the biennial opened. They found a way of channel out this money only directly to the artist, but it's, let's say, a consensus solution, as you can tell from that picture. So what? Just I would like to sum up with a few questions that I guess, in the long practice of Marion of cultural production, but of all of us, might be interesting in terms in questioning those boycotts. Looking a little bit beyond them. Of course, one question appears: what happened that within 1 year you had so many of them appearing? What is it? What is it that, for example, in case of Sydney, this family has always been the sponsor of that biennial? Why at that moment of time, this issue prevailed? And David Beach, in his essay, says that for him it's kind of a repercussion of Occupy movement. Of course, so already 3 years passed from them, and things have, of course, changed. But then he says it's this, the Occupy within one particular claim arrive in some way to the art world, as he says here in this first quote. You can, of course, read those boycotts in relation post-institutional critique. You can read them through rapprochement between art and activism, of course, and again in the line of political uprising, finding the way in art. We have an essay also from Georg Schulet about anatomy of the boycott, so how it's related and grounded in art strike, in withdrawal, in consumer boycotts, in, of course, whistleblowing character. It's also very much some kind of a whistleblowing strategy arriving to art. Boris Budin writes about the hegemony and the relations related to the boycotts. It's not, you know, of course, in boycott very often you have a power situation. So who is there, who has a right to boycott, or who has maybe sometimes in art the privilege to boycott or to withdraw. Of course, we also try to differentiate between boycotts and withdrawals and between inside and outside. I'm just like using the general term. What are the hidden agendas, of course, and what also the fact, how to finally, how to address the art boycott. And there is very, to my mind, interesting interview with Tirdat Zohait again, who says something. You know, he's researching this interdeterminacy of art, the fact that art never claims to want something concrete, because that would devote and deprive art from this much larger ability to just ask questions. So with Suhail Malik, it's a researcher on interdeterminacy, and he makes an interesting statement saying that in boycotts, because there is this very clear claim, you know, there is a clear wish for something, that in boycotts you actually might have that it might be a supplementary for a need for another, perhaps another form of art. Another form of art to come that needs to take more political edge, more clear statement, but yet we don't know how to do it. So for time being, shortly, there is a group of artists who says, once we were artists, but here now we are at that moment, we are boycotters, for something. And and I mean, he opens it up in that sense as a boycottologist as he is, because he also has been studying boycotts in recent years and quite as usually writes in depth about them. Yeah, so I wanted to bring this on the table as a first thing, and in the second very short part speak about a notion of the artwork connected with Marion practice and something that we have worked on together. So here you see Marion in Göteborg in 2013 installing her work on the shores with the main question: how do you shipwreck in the harbor? So how do you shipwreck in the harbor? And also on the right, I thought I'll share also this picture of Matteo being on the guided tour around those works. So what was this is just a context. It was an art exhibition located in the harbor of Göteborg, called Art Climb, Legally on the Edge. So Marion, as she does often, has engaged both in also the legal terms, in a symbolic figure of a shipwreck, but also in the legal terms of what it is actually legally, with the distress at sea, and also with the maritime law, what is actually an act of shipwrecking and shipwreck. So the starting point was this boat, Chinese, quite beautiful former Chinese restaurant, slowly shipwrecking in this harbor. So slowly, what is the English word? So, sinking, yeah. Slowly sinking, being half abandoned, and of course it opened up a whole fascinating research about the fact that Göteborg was so important for the Chinese and Indian trade with Sweden. The fact that now the Volvo factory located in Göteborg is actually being produced, the Volvo is being produced in China and shipped back to Göteborg. So you can imagine the feeling of Swedish pride, replaced by these cars arriving from China. So, so this cadaver of that ship became a starting point for for a film at the end, which was also a delegated film. So you partly film it yourself, but you actually directed somebody else to film it. That this is a screenshot. I also realized I don't have this film actually, which I have to ask you to to give me a copy. I would love to show you, but I don't have it now with me. But this is a good image standing for it. So on one hand, you know, it was a kind of a contemporary landscape that Marion you created. So on one hand, referring to these 3 million of ships sinking somewhere in the ocean, but actually making realize that 90% of them are very often sinking in the harbors. They already sinking in the harbors, and they are a way also of course, delegating problems or sinking problems, or they are carrier of information about terms and conditions in which somebody's enterprise, for example, functions. The film also was linking to, of course, Caspar David Friedrich, but not absolutely, as you might guess, not in any romantic way. It was rather to the fact, I remember you were saying that it was linking to the fact that we lost capacities of reading those kind of landscapes politically. That even under Romantic era, they had a very political dimension. And in some way, by creating something that looks also referring to a romantic imaginary, you actually gave a very political reading of connecting with the Göteborg harbor back then, and to the weather conditions, for example. And I think also that, yeah, and finally also to the legal questions regarding wrecks. And the fact that actually harbor is supposed to be the safe zone. Yeah, this harbor is a safe haven, so to say. But this is where 90% of wrecks are being shipwrecked. And I hope maybe maybe today or maybe the other day you will have an opportunity to see this film somehow. And to I don't know if this work has been done later on. I mean, we showed it once in New York together, but then I don't know if it has ever been shown. Yeah, we did, yeah, but then maybe, I don't know if it has traveled, so to say, later, no. Yeah, so I think I will stop there. I tried to, yeah, connect this thought and thing somehow that you mentioned also, and I'm happy to continue talking with all of you. Thank you very much.